Welcome to the ICIE Talks. Today we have Dr. Ken Reimer from University of Winnipeg in Canada to talk about the critical necessity of international collaboration. Dr. Ken Reimer is an assistant professor at the University of Winnipeg in Canada. Prior to this, he had a 25-year career in Canada's public school system. This included positions as a mainstream special education and resource teacher, guidance counselor, and the school principal in 6 different schools in 2 different school divisions. Dr. Reimer holds a PhD in education from the University of Manitoba. His primary research interests have focused on inclusive special education, school leadership, creativity, educational policy, graduation rates, at-risk learners, and teacher collaboration. He has served as president of the Manitoba Council for Exceptional Children. Dr. Reimer has taught at the University of Winnipeg in Canada, University of Manitoba, the Federal University in Russia, and Cambridge University in England. He has presented papers at several different national and international conferences. Recent world events have demonstrated the urgent need for international cooperation. While borders closed and travel restrictions have made transnational collaborations more difficult, the current medical, academic, and economic issues we face require a combined global effort. This presentation explores the crucial need for between international collaboration. Welcome to the ICIE Talks.
Okay, good morning or good evening. Hello, my name is Dr. Ken Reimer. I am an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education in the University of Winnipeg. This is located in the country of Canada. And I thank you very much for listening to my presentation. My presentation today is titled, The Critical Necessity of International Collaboration. And I wanted to talk about this topic today with you because particularly dealing with our current circumstances, which is affected everyone worldwide, and that's COVID-19 and what it's caused. And it's caused one of the most popular terms that we have heard certainly here in Canada and I think around the world is the importance of social distancing. We need to socially distance, and some people don't like that term and they've referred to it as physically distance for the safety of people in our cities, in our countries, around the world. We need to socially or physically distance. And this, along with many other situations around the world, and not just because of COVID-19, has created an international distance. And recent world events around all over have demonstrated that now is the time to continue to seek out ways for international collaboration and cooperation. And I particularly speak to people in the academic world when I talk about this. I speak about educators, I speak about people in universities, I speak to people who work in schools, people who develop policies for education. We need international collaboration and cooperation now more than ever. With border closures and travel restrictions, certainly has made transnational collaborations more difficult. The current medical, academic, and economic issues we face requires a combined global effort. As academics, international collaboration, in my opinion, is absolutely essential. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of it, and then I'm going to share some tips that I have shared before onto some ways in which you can practice being successful at international collaboration in the academic realm. So I want to start by just showing you a picture, and I'm going to begin with a bit of a metaphor, and I want to talk about a monolith and the term monolith. In November 2020, a monolith was discovered in a remote area in Utah, and this is located in the United States of America. This is an actual photo of the monolith, and that was found. It's a metal pillar, and it was as mysterious as it was attractive or impressive. It attracted a lot of worldwide attention. Where did it come from? Who put this here? What is it doing here? What does it represent? In December of 2020, the Utah monolith strangely vanished as abruptly as it arrived. Since this Utah monument disappeared, over 200 monoliths similar to this Utah monolith have been reported all around the world. Several have popped up in Canada. So what exactly is a monolith? Merriam-Webster describes a monolith as a single great stone, often in the form of an obelisk or a column. It can be a massive structure. And it can also be an organized whole that acts as a single, unified, powerful, or influential force. Giant stones, like the ones found in Stonehenge, are monoliths. The Eiffel Tower is a monolith. Nations and governments are like monoliths. They prominently stand alone, and they stand out. They're intentionally meant to be that way. Powerful governments deliberately want to project and reinforce its strength to an autonomy from other nations. In many ways, it makes their citizens feel safe. Certainly, examples can be found throughout history of governments working together and forming alliances. They do get together. The global search for the coronavirus vaccines this past year provides a recent and excellent example of this. Still, these relationships are often very temporary and can deteriorate as quickly as they are created. When nations connect to work together, sometimes it appears to resemble Stonehenge's post and lintel structure. While the monoliths of Stonehenge are connected and impressive to see, the rock lintels that connect the massive stones will appear shaky and impractical. The world cannot solely rely on monolithic governments to internationally connect. One structure that's better to the post and lintel system at supporting great weights is the arch. Historically, the arch has been relied upon to be the strongest support. Arches rely on smaller, strategically placed stones or blocks to span wide gaps. Britannica describes the arch as follows. Arch construction depends on wedge-shaped blocks. These blocks are called voussoirs. Each voussoir presses firmly against the neighboring blocks and conducts loads uniformly. The central voussoir is known as the keystone. Voussoirs are essential to the construction of an arch. Although they're much smaller than monoliths, many of them, carefully placed side by side, can support great weights. The most important voussoir is the keystone, and that can be found at the center and the apex of the arch. Academics act as voussoirs. Individually, their experiences, perspectives, and expertise are capable of carrying small weights. However, when they're connected together, and they connect together with other academics towards a common keystone or issue, they are capable of providing tremendous supports. Throughout history, civilizations have relied on arches to build bridges. Academics build metaphorical bridges that can bridge and connect between two places. The collaboration that we have seen, and that happens oftentimes, either very temporarily or on a more permanent basis. A prime example comes through ICIE, the International Center for Innovation and Education. This is an example of how academics can get together around a common keystone, in this case, innovation in education, in this case, inclusion in education, in this case, the keystone of gifted and talented in education. These are examples of how we can create bridges. Each academic and the knowledge and perspective that we share has acted as a voussoir. The keystone that connects us together is innovative education. As the keystone can also be a voussoir, I believe that in our situation, Dr. Tazir Yaman is a keystone and a key keystone in this collaboration, in these bridges that we are creating. He has helped make this collaboration possible since the beginning, and I just want to recognize and thank him for this. Although we're very far apart, many of us geographically. In fact, people, as I understand it, are watching this video from all around the world. ICIE and Dr. Tazir Yaman have helped build a bridge of intellectual reciprocity between many nations through his initiative. This bridge has helped to make a more innovative and inclusive education system, and ultimately, a more inclusive and innovative world. Oh, sorry. Now, how do we become Keystones? And that's the question. I'm going to talk about this a little bit. And I've shared some of this information before at past ICIE conferences. And I'd like to just share with you a little bit of an update on this as how we can become Keystones in our academic worlds. And I refer to this as something called correlational intelligence, or fitting the square into the circle. And I'd like to go and review with you just some ways in which you can become a keystone and create your own arches and your own bridges in your world. This may be with your academic peers. It may be from a larger systemic approach if you are a school superintendent or dean of a faculty. And it may be that you are a classroom teacher and you want to know how to build bridges based upon academia within your K-12 school systems. Whatever your universe, I hope that these some of these approaches or strategies that I highlight today are helpful for you. Now, what is correlation? Oxford defines this as a mutual relationship or connection between two or more things. And intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. Acquire and apply knowledge and skills. And so together, the term that I've coined is correlational intelligence. And I've written about this in an earlier ICIE journal, but I just wanted to highlight this here a little bit. And I hope you can find that article at some point when you decide. But this is the ability to connect between two or more things. And that things can be phenomena, people, products, ideas, in order to acquire and apply new knowledge, skills, and products. Now, what I'm going to share with you today is a bit of a recipe for correlational intelligence. And there are 7 points that I'm going to highlight here. And a lot of this is based on a literature review of things connecting with people, places, ideas, all sorts of different things. And so these are the 7 points that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about respecting autonomy. So if you want to connect with people and you like the idea of collaborating, the very first thing that must happen is you have to respect the autonomy of the individuals that you're working with. And you also have to appreciate the heuristics or independent spirit that each individual brings to a collaboration. I'll talk a little bit about social capital and let you know my perspectives on that. I'll talk about the importance of each person having a valued social role and why that's so important through one's life. I'll give a bit of a formula here based on some research that I've done, where I think that connections is really a combination, a clever combination of incentives and authenticity. The incentives aren't necessarily a prize or something shiny or money. There's a lot of different things. And I'll talk a little bit about authenticity and how it really connects with, you know, at its core, just being sincere. Harmonious coexistence, I'm going to highlight that just a little bit. I'll talk about the importance of creating a new shared or collective imagination. And number 7, I'll talk about how that the quickest way to create a connection, a collaboration, an arch, a bridge, is to find a metaphor, a shared metaphor. First off, let's talk about autonomy. And for this, I always like to use the Canada goose. I know that there are a lot of birds out there. You know, we have just last week flying overhead was a peregrine falcon, and we have robins, and we have a couple ducks just in our front yard here that have chosen to make my front yard and my wife's front yard a a home or a temporary home for a few months, I guess, during the summer months here in Canada. But if I were to pick what I think our national bird should be, I think it's the gray jay or something like that. But if I could pick a Canadian national bird that I think most closely represents the Canadian spirit, it would be the mighty Canada goose. And they're everywhere. In many places in regards, they're protected, depending on where you'll find them. But the mighty Canada goose is simply one of the most autonomous and independent birds you'll ever see. I'm not sure. I suppose each person will take a look at this bird that I have on display, and you may think that this is maybe a majestic bird. Maybe you'll think it's an awkward or funny looking bird. Whatever the case, no one can deny the autonomy or the independent spirit of the Canada goose. What you'll find, this is an article that was published a number of years ago, is that they actually create a lot of problems. Children, for example, have been warned, if you take them out on field trips or on a hike, that if you run into a goose, don't approach them. They look cute and friendly, and maybe they want a bite of your sandwich. In reality, they've been known to take out their wings and whack children so hard they've broken their arms. They chase people through parking lots. If they want to stop and have a nap or walk with their little goslings on a road at their own pace, they have been known to stop highways and shut down bridges. There's really nothing you can do. And at many times, one of the, as this headline somewhat jokes at, but really it's something serious. Can these geese and human beings even find peace together? Because there just seems to be a whole lot of opportunities for fights, or for disagreements, or for just an inability to live together. However, the one thing that you can say about these geese is that they really only live in Canada. They're called the Canada geese, and we appreciate that they're called Canada geese, but they only live here for about half of the season or half of the year. And in the other half of the year, this place is cold. Canada is a cold country. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And so they'll often fly to America or Mexico or parts of Central America each and every winter. And that's a journey that involves thousands and thousands of kilometers. And it's a journey that they cannot do on their own. And so these independent, stubborn, very much will defend themselves, and very much will watch out for themselves at the expense of others. When they need to fly south, they fly in the form of nearly a perfect V, so that they can take advantage of the geese flying in front of them and make it easier on them. And they have the ability, when they collectively work together in the form of a V, they collaborate better than any species I know. Perhaps the bees collaborate just as well. And I've known that there's some other insects like the ant that can collaborate like this. But for me, the example is simply the goose, because it represents so much about autonomy and independence, which is something that I think we have to always remember. There's an author named Shapiro who says that whenever you collaborate with people or organizations, you have to always be sensitive and respect the need for each individual's autonomy. And yet, if you do that, then it's just starts from the most, ensures most success by then you want to need to connect and fly in a V together. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about social capital, and I want to talk about its importance. Social capital is an interesting form. So capital Bourdieu talks about the fact that capital takes place and can occur in many ways. Most often when we first think about capital and accruing capital and collecting capital and spending capital, we think about money. We think about products like houses, and we think about maybe cars and other things like that represent capital. But we think in terms of economic capital. And Bourdieu actually says, and I'll refer to this a little bit later, that capital actually can occur in many different forms. It can occur in economic capital, which is the one that we often, our mind seems to immediately point to when we think about capital. But capital can also be in the form of social capital, and it can be in form of cultural capital. Cultural capital is what you know, so the stuff that you know, and social capital is who you know. Now, social capital is really, really valuable if you want to connect and collaborate with people and you want to work with people. Don't confuse this with homophily. Homophily is friendship, and friendship is basically, as Redika says, loving the same, where we make friends because we have a whole lot of compatible things about each other that just gets us to connect and want to hang out and get together with. Social capital is not the same as being friends, and sometimes this gets confused. And I can understand that it gets confused because oftentimes people can trade different things when they have friendships with other people, and convert that, because Bourdieu talks about the fact that capital can actually be converted. So you can convert social capital into economic capital. Who you know can help get you some stuff, in so to speak. And while that is true, and I believe that capital can be transferred from one form to another, don't confuse this with just being friendship, because friendships have benefits. There's no doubt about it. But they also increase the urge to otherize. One phrase, and I can't remember the author, is if you want to have a common friend, the easiest way to do it is find a common enemy. And so when you have friendships, they tend to otherize other people. And oftentimes when we want to collaborate in the academic world, we don't want to otherize people. It actually, it doesn't serve our purpose. It actually hurts or slows us down or is an obstacle to our purpose, because excuse me, that's a dangerous thing. The other thing about friendships, according to Angier, is that friendships are surprisingly fragile, and we have to remember that friendships are often very temporarily and often can break up, or they can be a problem with it, and it can happen very, very quickly. And so we need to be careful of that when we are talking about creating social capital. Social capital is the collective value of all social networks, so who we know and the inclinations that arise from the networks to do things. And Putnam refers to this, and he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. He refers to this as the norms of reciprocity. And so this is a bit of a quid pro quo, but it's constantly going back and forth. That the important thing, if you want to connect and collaborate with people, understand the importance of a this for that and a that for this, and that this constantly continues, and that you need to you need to accrue social capital if you want to be an international collaborator and promote international and worldwide collaboration. You need to understand the phenomena of social capital and how it works, how you spend it, how you receive it, how you need to both spend and receive social capital in order to make it work, because it has absolutely great value. According to Don Ambrose, Dr. Ambrose has been a speaker at several ICIE events. It has great value in connecting if you want to practice interdisciplinary collaboration. Now, the one thing just here that's important to remember is that oftentimes we think that when we make collaborations, that these have to last for a really long time. And Breakspear and Jones, who wrote a book called Teaching Sprints, how overloaded educators can keep getting better. Breakspear and Jones actually argue that point and say that oftentimes these marathon type relationships of collaboration oftentimes are detrimental, and they often can end, well, they can have a sad ending or an unhappy ending because they just go a very, very long time. And so oftentimes, and one thing I would encourage people is that if you are looking at collaborating with people and building upon social capital, is focus sometimes on sprints. And sprints are when it actually comes out of the technology sector, where you have technology companies that need to connect with other companies, and they decide they're going to connect very quickly. They're going to focus on a very specific task or area to implement improvement. And they're going to have a very finite amount of time in which to implement that improvement together. And so this is known as a sprint. And oftentimes I've seen it where people have had a coffee break and they've connected and they've talked about some ideas at an ICIE event, or they get together and they have lunch together. And that's one thing that I miss, because, you know, with these online and virtual conferences now, one thing I miss is getting together and eating and breaking bread together and sharing some stories. Those lunch times are really, really valuable in terms of social capital. I have had lunch breaks at at an ICIE conference where I simply get 2 or 3 really neat ideas from some presenters that I've asked to maybe touch base with and connect with and talk a little bit more about their presentation or their lecture. And those have been incredibly valued. And just because we never see each other and talk again, it doesn't mean that that wasn't an awesome collaboration. We had an incredible collaboration during that coffee break or during that lunch. And Breakspear says, don't ever underestimate that. Lunch sometimes isn't the start of the relationship or the collaboration, it is the collaboration. And there's nothing wrong with that because we leave better and smarter and able to take that social capital of connecting and having lunchtime together, we convert it to a cultural capital. We learn something through that breakfast at the hotel or that lunch at the conference or that dinner in town at the end of the conference. We learn something there, and then we can take the who we know and convert it to what we know, and we can bring that now to our new country, and we're all the better for it, or to our home country. And there's also marathons, there's no doubt about it. I'll talk about something that started as a sprint, a collaboration with Cambridge that came through Dr. Yemin and ICIE a little bit later, but sometimes they can go a little bit longer. Whatever the point is, eventually they may end. The race may end, whether it's a sprint or a marathon. And that's not an unhappy ending and shouldn't be a sad ending. We get together, we focus on something, we build the bridge, and that bridge is there for a long time, even if we're not meeting on that bridge for a very long time. Okay, so valued social roles. When you're going to collaborate with people, it can't just simply be anymore that you are the person on the spotlight on the stage and then there's the people in the audience. This surely can happen, and there are times for this in relationships where one person is talking with the other person and one person is the teacher and one person is the student, one person is the lecturer, one person is the audience, one person is the provider of information or knowledge, the other person is the receiver. This happens all the time. This is what teaching and learning is often all about. However, this work comes out of the work of Wolfensberger, who wrote about social role valorization theory. And his work really, the impetus or the beginning of this work was really all about providing people with exceptionalities or special needs a valuable social role and finding a valuable social role. And this is really important for everybody. And when you collaborate with people, you simply, whoever you're collaborating with, you need to find and develop and create valuable social roles for everybody. If everybody in a collaboration is a voussoir, you need to give everybody some weight to support, because everybody needs something to do. And you know, the line "everybody needs something to do" came from a story of a colleague of mine who works at a different university, who describes the experience of one time traveling with his father, and they went to a hotel and they opened the elevator, and there was a man with some exceptionalities, as he described it, who was hitting the floor hitting the button to the floor that they needed to go on the elevator. And when they got off the elevator, let's say the 7th floor, my colleague asked his dad, you know, we could have just pressed the button. I don't know if we needed someone in the elevator to do that. And the father pointed out rather astutely, and it was a good story, is, listen, son, everybody needs something to do. And really, this is true. This is the case. Everybody needs a valued role. And when people don't have something to do, those of you, I spent 25 years teaching in the public school sector and was a principal at a school, but I can tell you that for students, even in elementary years or in secondary or high school years, if students don't have something important to do, they're going to find something to do, and they will, as Carol Ann Tomlinson says, they're going to begin to revert to their lesser selves because they don't have a purpose with the collective. And so we encourage people, if you're a person with strong correlational intelligence, you need to identify individuals' abilities, and then you need to provide them with a valuable social role that connects with those capabilities so they can be successful in this collaboration. Connections, I've talked a little bit about this, but this comes from my work, my PhD work actually in 2014, that I took a look at my thesis. my research was on how do high school teachers connect with students, particularly their classroom students who are at risk of dropping out and do not see to be connected or engaged with the school system. I did some research working with high school teachers on what they did to try and connect with their students. And they provided a wide variety and array of different strategies and approaches they take. And I will not, at this point, go over all of them or even, well, there were a significant number of things, but I broke it down into two things. And again, I've referred to capital and Bourdieu, and a capital can be in all forms. But what they really did was they responded to the different forms of capital, even if the teachers couldn't articulate economic capital, cultural capital, social capital. They converted that into incentives. So when they worked with a student that, especially reluctant learners or students that were just not engaging, they focused on trying to find different incentives for the student so that the students could accrue some capital by coming to school. There's a lot of work in my area of work, which is inclusive education. There is a fair bit of research that supports the idea of people who are intrinsically motivated and extrinsically motivated. Extrinsically means that they'll do things for stuff. And intrinsically means that they'll do things because there's some type of internal reward. They're not seeking something external out there as a reward or a compensation for doing something. And I'm not sure if I still am convinced that this is the right angle or approach. While it is helpful to view things as intrinsic and extrinsic, and so it's a good constructive theory, I also like the construct that people do things for different incentives. It's just that it doesn't always have to be a gold star or a shiny sticker or a pizza lunch. Although when teachers needed to, they provided economic incentives, such as one teacher who baked 2 loaves of bread every day for 200 days a year because there were many kids who would come hungry and also would come late to class. And so by baking bread, students would actually come early because they wanted to have some of the bread. Sometimes teachers gave students little microloans so that they could buy a slice of pizza at lunch or participate in a field trip. But they also gave them other incentives like moral incentives. So you would have many type of, for example, one example with the school I worked at that people worked on recycling or composting materials and focused on sustainable education. And a lot of students were driven by that. So there was a moral incentive to participate in school. And when they got connected with school activities that they didn't need to be at, such as clubs or teams, and that speaks to social incentives like sports teams or theater or other types of clubs, when they connected with activities that they wasn't compulsory to attend, they would start more often attending compulsory things like their math classes or their English classes or their science classes. And so there is a connection, and there seems to be a correlation both in the literature and my specific research that these type of incentives seem to improve attendance, improve engagement, and make better connections. And when you're going to connect with people on doing something or having some type of innovative collaboration, then you've got to connect with the people too. It's first and foremost. It's not always required, but it sure does seem to promote the probability of success with your endeavor. The other thing, though, where teachers left off, it's not just simply about providing incentives, but it's also about appearing, as one teacher said, you got to appear authentic. And authentic really means that, as the teachers described in some things that I've read, is that you're just being a real person. You're being sincere. You're being sincere in your actions. And so if you don't like something, then you can grumble about it. You don't have to make everything seem like everything's wonderful in the world with your life and that we're always going to be positive. In fact, there's been some terms out there that there is a problem with toxic positivity. We've seen some articles that have been written on the problems with that when this coronavirus created a lot of lockdowns and a lot of issues. Leaders who were entirely positive all the time seem to get some negative resistance from some of their teachers and some of their colleagues because and employees, because it's simply things weren't all that great. So let's be sincere, let's be real about things. This connects well with a Canadian author named Malcolm Gladwell, who talks about the fact that this is called the principle of legitimacy, that everybody needs to have a voice, and the teacher, I'm saying the teacher in this case, but it could be any type of leader, is viewed as predictable and fair. And they recognize that the students recognize that they have a voice that will not always necessarily there will be followed, but it will at least be sincerely listened to. And so authenticity or legitimacy is a key part of this. And so I believe that if you want to connect with students, if you are a teacher, then I think that the combination of providing an economic response, as Levitt and Dubner really talk about economic, social, and moral incentives, and it connects with that, an economic response plus the principle of legitimacy can equal a real good opportunity to have successful teacher-student connections. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, and I'll just talk about this simply, we're on number 5 here, are the 3 scenarios for harmonious coexistence. Because oftentimes when we think about collaborating or connecting with people, we believe that there's only one way to do it, or there's only one type of relationship out there. And in fact, there are many types of collaboration models out there. I prefer this one by Florida. He talks about, he writes a book and talks about the strength of weak ties. And I think this is important. And in fact, there's been even a little bit of research out there with the coronavirus, that there are a lot of people who actually appreciate the fact that now that we're in a lockdown and we can't always get together, that we don't have to necessarily have these really strong, intense, familial type of relationships in everything we do. We don't need to get together 3 times or 4 times a week in person and have really long meetings or have entire days together. In fact, you can have weak ties, and there's actually a lot of strength to this. And so there are different types of relationships that you can have. And the other thing just to point out here is that these relationships can be, there can be fluidity in this, that you can have all of these types of coexistence that I'm about to describe can all occur with the same 2 people or the same 2 organizations. You can have separate coexistence. So you're just simply, you see the line between a circle and a square, you can be separate. You can assimilate, and you can get together and really try and create a common culture together, even if it's just like a very short sprint of a culture together. But you can also synthesize. And so again, this speaks a little bit to the Canada Goose, which is to me an example of synthesize, which is autonomy plus affiliations. So it's not do we support autonomy or do we support affiliation? We actually do what Levy in his book Tools for Critical Thinking describes, that we replace the word or with and. So we can respect autonomy, and yet we can also find ways to affiliate. And this is, I think, synthesize is the ideal method or way of coexisting in a collaboration. This is the method that I prefer, that you can be yourself, you can be heuristic in spirit, you can be independent in your spirit, you can be a rugged individualist, you can practice, you can be an iconoclast if you want to. All of these things can be true. But when you need to synthesize and work with somebody, you also respect that that person has all of the same rights and freedoms that you just described were important and necessary and critical for you, and yet you can still work together. So I prefer synthesis. However, I also want to say that you can have all 3 of these things at different stages of any collaboration. Now, this one is the power of shared, or it's referred to as collective imagination. And this is something that was highlighted by Harari, who's written a couple of very, well, these are the kind of books that you find in airports when you're looking for a book to read on a transnational flight. You can find a book by Harari, and he writes some interesting things. And he talks about the power of shared or collective imagination. And he talks about the fact that basically human beings rule the world, not because in the main reason is because we can cooperate flexibly in incredibly large numbers. And there are very few species out there that can cooperate flexibly in large numbers like the humans. In fact, no one collaborates like human beings can collaborate of all the species on Earth. We can create mass cooperation networks in which thousands and millions of complete strangers can work together towards a common goal. The real difference between us and chimpanzees, let's say, is this mysterious glue that enables millions of humans to cooperate effectively. And what is that mysterious glue? Harari says, he says that it's made up of stories. It's not genes. And I find that this is a constructive or helpful way to approach collaboration or connecting or correlating people, places, and things, is to view it like this, that oftentimes it's a collective imagination. We dream up something together, and we simply work based on that common dream. You can replace the word dream with stories. You can replace the term story with a mysterious glue. You can look at it as assumptions. You can look at it as a checklist of just rules or guidelines that we're going to follow, whatever that may be. But it enables human beings to cooperate effectively. It also enables millions of human beings to fight against other millions of human beings who have a different shared story or mysterious glue. And yet in this case, we're not looking at that issue. It's something to be cognizant of, this phenomenon, but we're looking at ways to connect or collaborate. So oftentimes what happens when you get two people together is you can have one shared imagination trying to connect with another shared imagination. And how do you now get two groups who have different shared imaginations? And let's say that in this case, we'll replace shared imagination with cultures. So you have two different cultures and they want to work together. How do you do this? Do you spend a whole lot of time trying to convince each other that one imagination is better than another one? In a lot of ways, I think we've seen that this has been practiced through the millennia, and it's really quite an inefficient way of doing things, and it probably just creates more barriers than connections. And so one area that I found to be quite beneficial and helpful, and I think Harari would speak about this, is if two groups of people or cultures want to get together and work together, try and find a metaphor so that you can connect and now have a new shared imagination. And it doesn't mean, as when I showed you the 3 ways of harmonious coexistence, that you abandon or ignore your shared connection. But when you get together and work together with this group, you have a shared imagination or a shared focus. There's lots of ways you can do that. We've seen many examples of 2 groups getting together and monoliths getting together. And the first thing to do is they get out their individual rule books and they start going through it and taking a look at how they can make this work and how they can't make it work, and you end up with a big volume of rules or laws or policies. That doesn't inspire thousands or millions of people to get on board and correlate and connect with other people. What often does, the simplest way, the most efficient way, is to find a metaphor. Find a metaphor that can connect you to, and when you do that, it's a nice simple way to then create that new shared imagination. I'm not suggesting that the rule books or the policies or the laws aren't important. They're incredibly important. They're incredibly important. And so I'm not dismissing that. I'm saying that don't start with that, because if we begin talking, and this is something, again, that Levy in his Tools for Critical Thinking talks about, if we begin by 2 groups getting together and talking about their differences and focusing on the differences between the 2 groups, you're not going to get anywhere. And so what Levy talks about is the points of critical distinction. Try and find ways that you can find a way that 2 groups or 2 or more groups can connect on similarities. In the case of the recent history, it can be finding a vaccine for this coronavirus. Find ways that you can have similarities. Create a metaphor. At some point, you have to acknowledge that there's a point of critical distinction or a fork in the road or a bifurcation or a break-off where there are differences, and that's okay. At some point, you must acknowledge that. Otherwise, we're just practicing some type of temporary assimilation that's never going to get anywhere, and eventually it's going to break down. But you will have to acknowledge there are differences, and still with a metaphor, you can find a way to create a new road to travel on together. And so let's talk a little bit about metaphors. And metaphors comes from a lot of work. Actually, that a great inspiration for me and the importance of metaphors is someone named Melanie Smith, who I connected with through ICIE, eventually to Cambridge University, and she's written a bit on metaphors, and I believe is working on a chapter right now for a future book on metaphors. Understand that what's a metaphor? Okay, there's no perfect analogy. We first have to recognize that whenever you create a metaphor, there are going to be issues and problems with it. But the metaphor is there to be a construct. It's there to be helpful. It's built to be purposeful and useful, like a house. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, we don't have to make it like as accurate as gravitational theory or molecular theory. It's just constructed to be helpful, and it connects. We acknowledge that there will be parts of the metaphor that isn't perfect, but it's really good when you need to focus on a common goal. How do you know when you found the right metaphor? Well, Shapiro says you found it. The key is emotional resonance. When it connects or has an emotional connection between two or more of the groups trying to get together, that's essential when you have a metaphor. Don't focus on perfection. There's no such thing as a perfect story or metaphor. However, metaphors have been told for millennia. One, because they're very powerful and they emotionally connect with people. And two, they're quick. You can tell a metaphor and it can simply cover, a good metaphor can cover so many different issues and connect so many different things. And so focus on a metaphor that has emotional resonance and not on perfection. Create one together if at all possible, especially in relationships with past tensions or conflict. They're really, really helpful at connecting. And sometimes a metaphor can really connect you in ways that you'd never think two groups could ever find anything in common with. And we talk again about harmonious coexistence that I highlighted before. Let me just give you one example of something where I worked with, where we found a common metaphor to work together. Now, I'm in inclusive education. And so a lot of that focuses on, you may refer to it as special education or working with people with exceptionalities. Often, this is the area that I work with. And yet somehow I found a connection with a local, and they have a local office here. They're an international and a very, very impressive video game company, known around the world, one of the biggest in the world. And I connected with one of the managers there, and we got to talking, and you know, through a common friend, we got to meet and connect. And we tried to look at ways and had some coffee and some walks and some lunches, trying to figure out ways that we could connect. We knew we wanted to work together, but we couldn't figure out why. And the metaphor that we used was creating Verrocchio Studio. And Verrocchio was the teacher or the mentor of Leonardo da Vinci. And in Verrocchio Studio, the young Leonardo, because before Leonardo became as big as he became, would work with others. They had to work with others in the studio, focusing on projects, on technique and theory. And it was a very interesting studio. It didn't just work on painting or drawing or even painting and sculpting. There were a whole lot of things and a whole lot of people working on a whole lot of things in that studio. And it was kind of like a universe in a big room. It included, there were people working on drafting, chemistry, metalworking, plaster, leatherworking, mechanics, carpentry, drawing, painting, sculpting, modeling, all sorts of different things were going on in that studio. Well, this was interesting, but what does this have to do with myself and this video game company? Well, the manager of the video game company, when I said, what's your biggest problem right now in the gaming industry? What's your biggest issue that you work with? And he talked about something called photogrammetry. And this isn't something that happened during Leonardo da Vinci's time, but it's something that's happening during our time. And he talked about this phenomenon of uncanny valley and said, this is a real issue for us. See, in video games, right now, the focus is you either make the video games very simple and cute and cartoony so that there's no doubt in the user's mind, the game player, the gamer's mind, that this is not real. This isn't reality. And in fact, we can see that this is a cartoon. The push now with video games is to create really realistic video games right now, to try and make the characters in the games look as close to human as possible. And so they spend a ton of money on getting, let's say, if they want to make an outdoor area, what they'll do is they'll put 1,000 cameras, I'm guessing 1,000 cameras, they'll put a whole bunch of cameras around a tree, and they'll take a lot of pictures of this tree at a lot of different angles. They'll try and convert that into some kind of pixels and put that in their video game. So the tree or the rock looks really realistic. It looks like it's a photograph. It doesn't look like it's a video game. He says this is not a problem when you're dealing with inanimate objects like a rock or to some extent a tree, but it creates a big situation, the phenomena of uncanny value, when they create people or they create animals or things that move around in the game. This is where you get the phenomenon of uncanny value. And what that means is uncanny valley is basically, well, it's used a lot in like horror movies or scary movies. They try and create characters that look as close to human as possible, but the closer they are to looking like a human without actually looking like a human, the mind, the user's mind or the viewer's mind can see this. And there's something called an uncanny valley, and that's the gap between what was created to look real and what isn't. And they'll make, oftentimes they'll make in scary movies, they'll make the villain or the evil, the bad guy in the movie look as close to human as possible, but something's just a little bit off. And subconsciously, we recognize that as viewers very quickly. We can see differences, and the more subtle the difference, the scarier it is for the viewer, or less realistic, and it's kind of a turnoff for the users. And so he discussed the fact that, you know, photogrammetry and trying to narrow the gap of the uncanny valley was the biggest issue he's dealing with. So how can I deal with this as an inclusive educator? And then we decided to come up with the metaphor of Verrocchio Studio, because we had a lot of unrelated disciplines working together to create something beautiful. So Leonardo da Vinci, what did he study? He didn't just study drawing. He actually worked with cadavers on a regular basis, and he studied anatomy. Here's some of his drawings on that. He studied mathematics, and he studied sfumato, which is the painting techniques for softening the transition between colors. And he really spent a lot of time studying shading and how shadows worked. And so one of the things that we came up with after we came up with this metaphor is we focused on the fact that it wasn't that perhaps this video game company needed to focus on more video game people to come up with a solution to the uncanny valley, because there's lots of reasons why people see that something doesn't seem real or seem accurate. And so we looked at Leonardo da Vinci, and we looked at the rose, and this was a color that Leonardo da Vinci wore. It was his favorite color. In fact, most of his clothing was this color. It became so synonymous with Leonardo da Vinci that they eventually created a rose in his honor called the Leonardo da Vinci rose, because this was the color that he wore all the time. And one thing that I said was that if somebody played the video game, and we looked at the video game, just go back one slide. If we look at the video game, while some people may be looking for the realism of the pixels, a historian or someone who's an expert in history or would recognize immediately that the video game designer did a great job making the character left-handed. That was really good. Did a good job of writing from right to left, which he often would do. That was really good. However, the character in the game wasn't wearing pink, and so the uncanny valley for the historian was you need to put a pink robe on the character of Leonardo da Vinci, because this character existed in a video game as well. And so this was an area that we said that interdisciplinary or seemingly unrelated groups getting together and collaborating and working together can often produce unexpected productive results. And I bring this up, and I'm getting near the end of my speech, because I want to talk about something that happened thanks to Dr. Yamin and thanks to ICIE, and because of an opportunity to speak in Portugal. So in 2017, I was invited to Lisbon. My wife and I went to Lisbon, and I was invited to give a speech in a keynote address in Portugal. And after I gave my speech or presentation, a young PhD candidate in the Department of Engineering at Cambridge wanted to interview me, and it was allowed to go to some of the best conferences in the world, international conferences focusing on innovation and education. and he wanted to interview me and talk to me about Canada. And as we got to talking very quickly, 10 minutes was all I met with him at a coffee break that was set up by ICIE in Portugal. Eventually, he sent me an email and says, you got to meet these people at Cambridge, this Faculty of Education, Department of Engineering. You need to get together with them, and they need to hear what you want to talk about with connecting, because they have some pretty good ideas that I think you two would work together well in. And so our two organizations, University of Winnipeg, the picture on the top there is my dean, Dr. Ken McCluskey, to the right, my former dean of education, and a longtime contributor to ICIE. And I'm on the left there. And then we see some colleagues from engineering and education from Cambridge. We got together and we started working together on a product that they have designed called Designing Our Tomorrow, which is basically an area where they teach through the process of empathic engineering. They teach young people how to identify issues that come up for an aging population. So, for example, how to open up medicine bottles when your eyes are failing and your hands are hurting from arthritis, or you've got some mobility issues. And so you see there on the bottom left, those are some students and some teachers actually from Beirut, or not from Beirut, from south of Beirut. I had the opportunity, first went to Cambridge, then let me get back a little bit. First, I go to Lisbon, connect with Cambridge. I go to Cambridge, we begin to work together. The next year in Paris, I bring Melanie Smith, who's located in the picture here, and I refer to her, and her and I present on DOT, Designing Our Tomorrow, at a Paris ICIE conference. And we speak about this at the ICIE keynote presentation that I delivered. Then we're invited to further explore DOT in Houston at the ICIE conference, actually in Prairie View, Texas. And there I present on this, and I meet people from all over the world, particularly people from the Middle East. And this is the first time that, to my knowledge, that DOT, or Designing Our Tomorrow, has been presented to people in a large audience in the Middle East. And I get invited, the next thing I know, in 2020 to Beirut and to Lebanon to present at a couple universities, including the REACH conference at the American University in Beirut. And now I find myself a year later speaking to an ICIE conference in Ajman, and I'm so grateful for this. And that's why I consider Dr. Tazir Yamin and ICIE to be a keystone in this collaboration. And obviously, based on some of the things that I talked about, I think that we can easily identify some of the key areas that Dr. Yamin and ICIE have this incredible amount of what I refer to as correlational intelligence. And DOT Canada, what was our metaphor? Our metaphor when I connected with Cambridge was a movie called The Artist, and also a story called We Can Do Better Than That, which is a story of a firefighter and a young boy dying of cancer. I won't get into that right now, but the metaphor that we used between Cambridge and the University of Winnipeg was The Artist. And this is a movie of basically about the genre of silent film and how it eventually transfers over to suddenly you can have sound in movies and you can have a voice in movies, and we wanted to give students voice. So our metaphor focused on giving students voice. We believe that if we teach students empathy and we teach students design skills, or some rudimentary engineering skills and project management skills, that they can create a better world for people, and giving student voice was key. And that's how we formed DOT Canada. And I'm happy to say it looks like we'll be working with many schools in the North and continue this innovation in the years to come. And so that's thanks to ICIE that we have that connection. So being a keystone, just to wrap this up right now, in order to have correlational intelligence, these are my 7 steps. You have to respect autonomy first. If you don't respect individuals, you can't work together as a collective. Number 2, social capital is key, and it's not to be confused with friendship. You can be friendly with people. You can turn out to develop a friendship with people you collaborate with, but don't confuse this. You don't have to be friends with people. That's actually a very fragile type of relationship, a friendship. And so focus on social capital, on working together. If you're collaborating with people, One of the key voussoirs in collaboration making this bridge is you got to give everybody a valuable social role. That's key. Everybody needs something real and meaningful to do in the group, or it's going to fall apart. Number 4, connections is really a recipe or a combination of incentives and authenticity. Just don't confuse incentives with only being economic incentives or stuff. There's lots of different forms of capital. There are many different forms of incentives. Tap into that. Find out what capital is valued by the people you're collaborating with. And sometimes it can be long, like life course persistent, and other times it can simply be situational incentives. Find what those things are and provide them. And also be prepared to receive things. Oftentimes people that are masters with correlational intelligence, they're really good at giving. Receiving is an issue, and yet you have to give the opportunity for your collaborators to give you something. And also authenticity, legitimacy, at the end of the day, be sincere. Harmonious coexistence, this can be situational. There are times to be apart, times to assimilate, and there are times where you still can be independent and yet you synergize on one particular topic together. Sometimes those can be sprints, sometimes they can be marathons. Create a new shared imagination. Never underestimate the importance of one's culture or their imagination or what their collective beliefs are or their stories that guide them, that are their North Stars. Never underestimate that. Together, try and find a new shared imagination. And to me, the quickest way to do that is to create a shared metaphor. Find a metaphor that has emotional resonance. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be close to perfect. And try and use that as, again, I use the term as your North Star in your collaboration. Or another thing would be your keystone. I want to conclude my presentation here by just concluding about bridges, a model for global bridges. Moving forward, how can academia and government work in partnership? I compared governments to monoliths and academics to voussoirs, or those little stones. One useful metaphor can be found in the most famous monolith and the most photographed landmark in the entire world, and this is France's Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower most resembles a magnificent monolith in every way, but when you look at it closely, the monolith of the Eiffel Tower is supported by 4 broad arches. In essence, arches support the monolith. At a time when mistrust and information seem to be on the rise both within and between nations, academics have the responsibility to share their expertise within and across borders. Nations that have historically been built upon a foundation of sound empirical advice have always thrived better compared to nations who haven't. Nations that have the capacity to work together with other nations are often much more prosperous than nations that are isolated and remote from the world. Our collaboration, focusing on the keystone of innovation education, has become the gold standard. I believe ICIE is the gold standard for working together and sharing experience with one another. Please, let us continue to respectfully find ways to collaborate further as innovative educators, academics, university faculties, and nations on such noble causes as the pursuit of respectful and inclusive and innovative education. In this way, we continue to build a bridge to more inclusive and innovative world and future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, my dear friend, Dr. Ken Reimer, for this impressive keynote. And it is really very interesting and informative lecture. We are so proud of you and highly appreciate all your continuous valuable contributions. So we are looking forward to see you soon in other international events, including our conference in Finland. And you know, there are many other events, so we're in cooperation with international institutions like Winnipeg University. So thank you so much for this lecture, and looking forward to meeting with you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.